So welcome back. I'm very excited. It's been a long time. I see that you're going back and forth from Vietnam to the United States constantly. What's happening during these trips? Like, why are you going back and forth a lot?
Yeah, we've been very fortunate that the market for us in the US has been growing really well. And I think us going back and forth a lot is not only to nurture the growth, but then also I think more importantly to have FaceTime and be on the ground and talk to people and interact with the community essentially. Not only in California, but all different states from Washington, New York, Louisiana. And it's in part not only to promote the brand. I think that's the obvious aspect of it, but I think more importantly is to interact with the community and see, what resonates with people and what's not, and what people are interested in, especially around our brand and the work that we're doing. And that's something that I think is really valuable for us to be on the ground.
It is. It's so important to have FaceTime with all of these leaders that you're hitting in New York and LA. And I want to know, while you're away and doing all this stuff, who's watching? How is the production in Vietnam being managed? Like, what's the sort of the logic behind the production? Is it sort of like just a one big batch and, it's not that difficult to manage? Or is it a very intricate process that needs somebody with your distinct tongue to understand what's going on, right or wrong, in Vietnam?
Yeah, it's actually a really tough balance. And so the reason I can't stay in the US for, the whole year, for example, is I still have to do all of the sign off or the quality control on each batch. So we do have staff on the ground in Vietnam who work on the production, the sourcing, the supply chain, for example. But when it comes to signing off before the bottles are sent off, it's still me. And in that way, it's still there still is this kind of like a sense of craft, just because things are still signed off batch by batch, and that's yeah, that's kind of the double-edged sword behind I guess like craft manufacturing. But yeah, so that's essentially how we operate. Is I can travel, whether it be to the US or to another market. But then every other month or so, I have to be back in Vietnam to sign off on everything that's about to be sent off.
So when you sign off on something, I don't know if we talked about this in, a few years ago, but when you sign off on something, is it something very qualitative, quantitative, where there's numbers, where you dip a meter in and and it hits certain numbers, and you're like, okay, that department is good to go, this department is good to go, and then you actually use your facilities, your taste and your nose to go, okay, that is kind of where I want it. And how do you consistently get it to where you want it to go, with your nose, all the time and consistently?
Yeah, it's really tough. It's both a numbers and a qualitative game. So the numbers um allow you just to make the standards. So say for example, like safety protocol or making sure that it's actually the amount of alcohol that's on the label, and that doesn't require me to be there. The staff and our lab can measure all of that regardless, but the qualitative aspect is difficult, and it's actually not unique to just us. So in a lot of distilleries or a lot of wineries, for example, or even perfumeries, one of the most important job positions is the blender, or in France they call it a gosh, I can't remember the name of the this particular person, but it's the person who's in charge of assembling the product. I think in the French term they call it assemblage, and élevage. Élevage is to take care of the product while it's maturing, and then assemblage is to actually put it together as a cohesive product. And what I mean by that is, so say for example, any batch of like cognac or whiskey does require blending, because even at a mass production level, there's no way you can guarantee uniformity, in the same barrel warehouse, for example. And so it's something that you generally just have to keep on doing. And I think like I'm not at that level, I don't think, but certain blenders for big brands have their noses insured for tens of millions of dollars, for example. It's insane.
Yeah.
But it's yeah.
And what else is insane is that you don't come from a lineage of guys who are like quote unquote like like in the beer world like brewmasters, right? You don't come
Yeah.
from a tradition. I mean, what Vietnamese person does come from that tradition in Vietnam or the diaspora? Not much, not many of us, if any.
Yeah, we don't have a history. I mean, I shouldn't say we don't have a history, but we don't have a modern commercial history of these types of products. And it's actually quite an interesting debate because it's a little bit of a crossroads and growing pains for Vietnam as we are as a country and a people, because as we are modernizing, sometimes these kinds of crafts will be done away with essentially for the sake of modernity, and I think a great example is like fish sauce, for example. That's a whole nother story, but how the rise of industrial fish sauce is actually not really made from fish anymore in Vietnam. But anyways, yeah, we don't come from a modern history of this kind of lineage, but I think traditionally we do have it. It's just never been traditionally commercially modernized in a globalized economy, if you will.
Well, I can't let you continue about this whole fish sauce thing.
Yeah.
You hit on a deep nerve. What do you mean it's not made with fish anymore? I just had Kung from Red Boat on, and we never even came close to something like that. What's going on?
So this is it's a point of controversy, but it's also not something that's hidden. Is a lot of the industrial fish sauce in Vietnam right now is actually made from amino acids, which is it's the chemical building blocks of protein and umami, and it's actually the constituents of what we would consider fish sauce, but it actually doesn't need to be made from fish. You can actually make amino acids by fermenting rice, for example, or soy, for example. And it's well, I don't know how much maybe you could edit this part out or maybe not, but it's a lot of the conglomerates such as Masan Group are responsible for the industrialization of fish sauce, but also the fakeification of fish sauce, if you will. And one of the problems that we have is the definition of fish sauce is so loose that it allows these groups. And every year when they have these meetups and these conferences in Vietnam, there's always a point of contention because for a long time, and the last time I was at this conference was probably 7 or 8 years ago. So this is actually before Song Cai. The big controversy was, why are people allowing Masan to sit at the same table as traditional fish sauce makers? But because that fish sauce is, one, it's quicker to produce and therefore it's cheaper to produce. It has a lot more mass appeal. And this is actually doublethink. It's really Orwellian, that people actually become very accustomed to that type of fish sauce, that when they actually have fish sauce like Anh Cuong's Red Boat, they no longer are accustomed to the taste. And a great point about this is actually our distillery, our staff meals. I have a case of Red Boat and the staff can't eat it because it has such an intense flavor that they went back to the Masan stuff. And this other part is also controversial. When I visited Anh Cuong before, the person who was driving the boat was also using Masan fish sauce. It's so ubiquitous. It's almost like us saying, Kenneth, why are we not making our own Coca-Cola anymore? And we're just, buying the stuff off the shelf, and it's not really made with, coca leaves or anything like that. It's kind of in the same vein in the sense, and it's actually really shocking because, when we ask people, like I asked the distillery just out of curiosity, it's like, do you know that this Red Boat fish sauce is real fish sauce? And they're like, oh, wow, yeah. And I was like, well, don't you feel it's kind of weird that we're on a day-to-day basis not actually using fish sauce and it's called fish sauce? And like, yeah, but it's just something that they're so accustomed to, like Vietnamese people in Vietnam, that's just, you know, even with that principle in mind, the bottle of fish sauce, that red boat, is still half used, and they're still going through gallons of other like masan and stuff. It's a very distinctly different flavor. It's less pungent, it's more sweet and things like that.
You
Um,
know how I feel right now? I feel like I'm a 55-year-old man just learning. I'm not 55, but I feel like I'm a 55-year-old man just learning that my father had a second family for the first time.
Yeah, it's really shocking, and also like the three crabs fish sauce in America and things like that, or the fish sauce that has phu quoc on it, like
Yeah.
the max one, right? In America is actually not made in Vietnam; it's made in Thailand. And it's actually a copyright breach. Um, but Vietnam doesn't really we're not good at defending our own IP, but most of the fish sauce we eat in America as Vietnamese diaspora is actually not even made in Vietnam. So it's yeah, it's a the whole fish sauce thing. I think Anh Cuong and Red Boat. I mean, I have a soft spot for it because I think they're fighting the really good fight.
Wow.
And it's something that if you, I don't know if you visited, but it's really shocking how quickly things are. I guess like the decline in the amount of fish sauce producers in Phu Quoc, for example. There's a lot of things we can get into that, but it's just like, yeah, it's a lot of double think. Like we're not sometimes in for the sake of modernity and development, a lot of things fall by the wayside. And fish sauce is a really good example of that, you know.
So since we're on this debate, right? Like I get what you're saying about like not being able to really even crave real fish sauce or know the difference, or even being so conditioned to have this amino acid, basically fish sauce from a petri dish, right? But that all being said, would can't we make an argument that this is good for the environment, or this is good for the ecosystem, and we're not overfishing anchovies and therefore allowing the ocean to replenish its supply of more fish?
Yeah, we could make. I mean, there's always a tug and pull, right? I think one of the things, I think the major thing here is I think we can make alternatives to fish sauce, which is already being made. But there needs to be a transparency behind it. So for example, we make an alternative to, say, like, I don't know, champagne. I don't think the French would sit around and let us use the word champagne for a faux champagne. Because it just like it cheapens and it dilutes their brand. Whereas we're allowing I think the devil's in the details. Let's call it something else, but why are we allowing it to be sold as Nước Mắm, for example? There should be more stringent regulations and enforcement of regulations so people know that, hey, this isn't fish sauce by definition. Because I think the dangerous thing here, and I think the main point is it's very Orwellian, very double speak, because then we can become the condition to calling something that's not fish sauce, and it just changes everyone's mindsets completely. It's actually a really generational and countrywide reprogramming, which is kind of insane. Um,
Now, that all comes into a little bit more now narrower focus for me, which is different sets of laws and different departments of legal sort of uh, when the government has to go in and enforce. So legal enforcement in Vietnam, as it relates to in country and out into the real world of beyond Vietnam's borders of enforcement. Like when you say that fish sauce that is produced in Thailand is doing copyright infringement, who's going to enforce that? A, and what are they actually? How are they crossing the line? Other than saying that this is Vietnamese, but it's produced in Thailand.
yeah, I think so. With the say with like AOC, AOC's like the kind of brand or designation for specific oh, actually I have some right here. I went to France. We went to France, and I keep um I keep this packet as an example. So this is just like a French cheese cracker. And it actually says very clearly on here, and the French are really good at this, and the Europeans in general, it's AOP. So it says AOP on here, meaning that the cheese used in here has to be from Britain or Brittany. And they often do that with the butters and things like that. And it's they and this kind of like transparency in terms of supply chain and what types of products are being made where, and making sure that they go to bat for the farmers or for the producers. That's all done by an agency that's actually under the equivalent of the USDA, the Department of Agriculture in France or in Italy. And there are very recent occasions of this where the French, or I believe the Swiss, I don't remember one of the two countries, actually went to legal court to sue the U.S. government because they allowed a cheesemaker in a certain state to produce Swiss cheese. So yeah, I guess it's from not from France, but saying that, yay, you can't allow a farmer that's not from this AOP to be producing and marketing this quote unquote Swiss cheese if it's not made in our country, for example. And so this is actually a very crucial discussion on the role of soft power, because a European country, like especially a Western European country, has a lot more like clout to go to bat with a country like the US for, as opposed to, say, for example, Vietnam. We do have certain designations such as Phu Quoc fish sauce, but between that or trying to negotiate even just any trade deal with the US, I think that often falls by the wayside. We don't have that kind of soft power. And it's something that has been brought up over and over again. Things like losing the IP to ST25 rice, for example, or going to bat for pho, because there was a recent controversy where a Chinese company was actually manufacturing pho, not in Vietnam, and then selling it to the US, for example. So there's a lot of cases where producers are starting to push, and Song Cai, us being one of them, is pushing the Vietnamese government, for example. It's like, hey, it doesn't make sense to be giving out all these designations if you don't go to bat for us. It's just giving out designations for fun, but they only have meaning if you really defend them, and it's not only with the international market, but we also have to start at home in Vietnam. I think I don't know if we talked about it last time, but it's still, we have not made enough progress even from 2 to 3 years ago. For example, like bưởi diễn, like diễn pomelos, for example. We buy from someone that's in the village who has a certification from the government. It's like, I grow this particular bưởi diễn in the Diễn village. And if you step outside of that village, people are just undercutting it by half, and they're still allowed to grow that bưởi and sell it as bưởi diễn. And that's actually a disservice to not only the farmers, but to consumers, because you don't know what you're getting, and yeah, so I think that's kind of where we're at. It's not only a question of soft power from government to government, but it's also it's on us as consumers to be as stringent and demanding as much in terms of quality and transparency as we would with any other product, like a French cheese or like anything in Japan, for example. It's like, why can't we hold ourselves to that kind of standard and that kind of level of respect, and we can't demand that unless we start with ourselves as well.
I come here for the gin and alcohol, and I get lessons on civics and politics and how we should be doing, this legal kind of reformation for our brand. I mean, and essentially what's happening is this is all brand new for the country of Vietnam. All of this sort of enforcement, this idea of source origin, things are being developed for the terroir, if you will, and marketed and branded for it, is not a tradition that we have throughout Vietnamese history. Has it been?
I think it has. Like, I guess, like, if we it has and it hasn't. I think Vietnam has a very interesting relationship in terms of governance. But if just keeping on the same vein as as what we were talking about before with pomelos, is there is a documented history of, say, like Brazilian and it's one of the two sweetest pomelos, naturally sweet pomelos in Vietnam, and it was offered to kings. I think one of the things that we as a country have faced is we're not a young country in terms of like how many years we've been around. Um, but if you look at kind of like the tumultuous history, and it's all packed into the last like 150 years of all this upheaval and turmoil, and that's nothing new. I mean, we've been doing, Vietnam has had that kind of tumultuousness with the Chinese and whatnot. But what I'm trying to get at is Vietnamese, because of the long history of struggle and tumultuousness, we have this kind of like really intense survival attitude. And sometimes survival attitude is we forego certain types of like quote unquote luxuries, for example. And I think one of the things that we also have embedded in us is we don't think that what we have is worth, I don't know, say like a high price tag or can stand alongside other products, for example. I think that actually Vietnamese pomelos are some of the best in the world. But we don't have that kind of like, it's really hard to find someone in Vietnam who would be able to have that kind of confidence, say, yes, our pomelos are some of the best in the world. And it's like, we're nothing to be messed with. Like that kind of self-confidence, I think, is lacking. It's changing, of course, but I think that reflects in how we defend our IP. Is it worthy of being defended? Is it worthy of going to bat? Like if you really treasure something, yes, you would go to bat for it. It's I think it's a reflection of us. But it's changing. I think it's changing.
When you think about 1,000 year of Japanese artisan culture, and you think
Yeah.
about the traditions that go deep, right? 1,000 is probably the starting number, but I bet that there's a 1,500, 1,200 year tradition that continues with sword making or whatever, mochi making. We are a relatively new country when it comes to these sort of processes that are elevated within our own mind, right? We don't put a invaluable price tag like this is like off limits, this is priceless. We don't have that culture yet. And having people like you on the ground and pushing for, I don't know what else to call it, but artisan culture, like this deep respect for process, right? And to facilitate, to get the government to see how important that we just don't go in and just do things bye. We just go in
Yeah.
and we have to put our 1,000-year-old hat for our
Okay.
profession and really put it on the line and say, you know what? Company A is going to compete with company B in this for like 300 years, 400 years, and we're going at it. And these are the only ways that, tried and true process of making gin or making whatever product that we put our stamp of approval on. We have to have that sort of sense of deep pride. And is it being corroded as this new age of social media and the ways that are a TikTok culture and things are just going quick and fast? Or as a result of social media, are we having a renaissance, a rebirth of a respect for processes? Because I know in the U.S., some places in the far in back east, they're making a metalwork that is going back to the anvil and just really working on the idea of like artisan production.
Yeah, I think, well, social media is definitely a double-edged sword. I think social media has a lot of benefits. Without social media, a lot of these artisan um villages, for example, wouldn't have the light of day to be able to reach a global audience. And without a global audience, and I think this is, unfortunately, we have a little bit of a bad habit of being xinguai, is oftentimes that we seek outside approval and validation before we value it ourselves. And a great example of this is Dzao. in the north, when it was written up by, I believe it was either CNN or New York Times. It was just blew up in terms of wow, this is like something like that's validated by this huge American news outlet, which is great. I think that's amazing. But then it's like, do we really, why do we need that to happen before we say, hey, yes, maybe we shouldn't destroy this or let this craft erode completely, for example. Another great example is Hangzhou, for example. It's like Mac Yin is the last person on the globe that can do this, and he hasn't been able to find a student. That's insane to me. And he's not the only one. There's so many of the crafts like that that are just going extinct. And I think social media, what that does is social media, the good side of social media is, hey, look at all these crazy, amazing things. You know who's actually really great at doing that is the China, because I scroll through TikTok a lot on I guess I'm on the craft artisan TikTok, but they have amazing videos that highlight how oh, this person's continuing this 1,000-year-old legacy of pottery, for example, or how paper was traditionally made in China and whatnot. And there's so many views on that, and it's TikTok or like social media has an amazing ability to amplify. But of course, the negative side of it is it also has an amazing ability to amplify stuff that's misinformation or maybe like the fast new trend to maybe even erode away the tradition even quicker. For example, I think one of the key examples of this is there's a very famous now famous banh mi place in Hanoi. I'm not going to say the name just because I'm don't want to get detract from their business, because it is still a local business, but they've erupted in terms of popularity, and they're not even like an original banh mi spot, like an old school banh mi spot, and they've got lines of Westerners just like out the block.
But
So
how did they accomplish that?
I don't know. I think it's like, well, the idea is you're just trying to go viral, but you may not, if you go to this banh mi spot, anytime you're in Vietnam, like let me know. We could go past it and you'll see it's so stark because only Westerners eat there.
So that's
You know what I mean?
modern fuckery, right? I mean,
Yeah. And the crazy thing is everyone who's like a food blogger will blog about that, and it will just rebound and just like keep amplifying that. Oh, this is Hanoian banh mi. Oh, this is Hanoian banh mi. But no Hanoians are eating it. It's like, so that's the bad side of social media. But the good side is, hey, we can now start to amplify all these craft villages and all these people who before didn't have access to a global audience, and they can sustain their livelihood or modernize their application of their craft, for example, in ways that would not have been possible otherwise. So that's the good side of this globalized economy and social media and the role of social media. But the bad side is also, there's people get fixated on the bad side, which is, very deservedly so. But we also have to realize that, like, for example, what we're trying to do with the red Dzao medicine craft or tradition, for example, would not have been possible or would not be possible without social media, for example. Farmers using Facebook now, like, it's just an amazing way to communicate and bridge barriers, geographic, social, language, and whatnot that wasn't around before.
Yeah, I hope that there is somebody on the ground doing YouTube videos dedicated to artisans, and like this one TikTok video I saw with I think it was a Japanese block ink maker.
Oh yeah.
Oh my God, that was so interesting. I think it was like a 300-year-old company in Japan.
Yeah.
They broke it down like this block is worth $1,000, right?
Yeah.
The same block in India. Yeah. The same block in India is like $9. Maybe.
Yeah. I know, right? And that's the crazy thing. And I think, like, it's just the ability of social media to do that. But then also, again, this also goes back to this mindset that in Japan, they're like, we're nothing to be messed with. Like, this is an amazing lineage. Like, I would argue that we can take that same mentality and apply it to something like Dzao, for example. Like it's the same kind of thing, right? Like it's not fast paper making. This paper making is literally by hand. Like every sheet of paper is literally poured by hand. And I think like the reverence of that, like if you think about that versus like the ink block video, if we were just to juxtapose, like we wouldn't say like, oh, this is made in Vietnam, but what if that was just someone just said, oh, this is made in Japan, and how that kind of reverence would, you know what I mean?
Dude,
Like
so
we don't have that same kind of like clout,
Daniel, this is probably the most uh, frustrating thing about talking about our culture sometimes is the lack of reverence for process, is the
Yeah.
lack of reverence for uh fuck money. Let's just
Yeah.
get this thing done the right way for 1,000 years, and let's just see how far we can take the craft of this original craft and the way this has been done for hundreds of years, and let's just see how we can make it better, micro better every iteration. And that is, I think, a an attribute that the Japanese culture has, and perhaps the German culture and the French culture. And how do we instill that into our country, into Vietnam, to produce like high quality artisans one day? Because without it, we're not going to ever be, I mean, we want to be famous for the work that we do, and we cannot arrive at this sort of place in the world if we don't talk about it and we don't find a way to instill this sort of cultural pride that out of this place in the world we produce X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, it's that's so hard because we have to change so many things. It's not only changing the global perspective of Vietnam, like we're already making so much progress in changing, like just like in Hollywood now, like the representation of not only just Asian Americans but also Vietnamese Americans is rapidly changing it. But I think like going beyond this global brand that Vietnam is a war, I think that's such an amazing feat that we're undertaking as a community. But that's only impacting how people from the outside view us. But internally, we have such a long way to go to say, for example, we don't have a very good vocabulary for craft, because the way that you translate craft is thủ công, and thủ công has a little bit of a negative
Negative
meaning
connotation. Yeah, automatically
yeah.
you're a manual labor. That's
Yeah.
when you think of the word tukam, it's it automatically puts you. Craft is such a beautiful word if you really
Yeah.
think about it, right? It can
Yeah.
mean so many dynamic ideas that require your attention and your sort of your motor skills, whatever it is. It just requires process. But when you think of tukam, this is manual labor.
Yeah.
I mean, literally
And it's
manual labor.
and it's amateur. It sounds amateur and it sounds cheap. And it's just that's such a travesty. And then we demand so little and we expect so little and we undercut each other all the time. It's actually really devastating. Like I think, like, for example, like it's just products that are made in Vietnam, for example, never garner, like it's so hard to garner a high price. And that's just like the sad mentality of it, like the idea of tukong or things like that. It's just our vocabulary isn't there yet,
Okay,
and I think
so
we should be
so
beginning.
this translates. Oh, wow, this is a root cause of another. Maybe this is a root. I don't want to make. I hate the causation correlation. I try to really stay away from those kind of ways of thinking. But if we don't value our own, starting at the Tokong level or at the wordplay level, at the root etymology of what we're trying to kind of like uh uh what we're trying to infuse into the pride and work on the bigger stage, when you pull back and you go into New York and LA and you look at Vietnamese food versus Italian food or Japanese food, it's projected in the pricing.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
projected in the pricing and the value orientation of the consumer, and it trickles down from like the history of artisans and craft and tukang to now modern America, big city. We don't command the same price, even when our ingredients are higher quality and our process is higher quality and takes more labor than an Italian dish. And
Oh, totally.
I hate to keep hammering this point home over and over again.
It's no, but it's really important because the more you hammer it home, it's the more it becomes embedded in the national dialogue, because you have such an amazing reach, and it's really important that it just stays in the forefront. So for example, I think like it's just the age, it's not an age old, but it's definitely a metaphor or comparison that's been used over and over. It's like ramen versus pho. In essence, it's literally pretty much the same thing, except you would never question a $20-$30 bowl of ramen. If you were to even go to New York and you ask people who are leading, one of some of the first Vietnamese restaurants in Manhattan, how the struggles they had to deal with in terms of charging more than $20 for a bowl of pho, it's just insane,
And if you think about it, ramen is just the boiling of fat, right?
Yes.
Which
Yeah.
is crap. It's horrible nutritiously. And if you think about pho, it's the boiling of bones, collagen, protein. It's power coming out of it. It's source power of fixing your sickness when you're sick. And it's like drinking chicken broth and bone broth. Why is bone broth cheaper than melting fat? Doesn't make any sense to me.
It doesn't make any, well, yeah, exactly. And it's and there's such an amazing, like if you look at pho and like the way that Vietnamese people ascribe quality to pho, it's actually so labor intensive because it requires emulsification and clarification of the broth. Like you can just throw, like what you're saying, fat, bones. I'm not trying to, discredit Japanese ramen. I think it's an amazing, like, what we got to do is we got to get ourselves to that level, but instead of taking ramen down. But I would say that pho, for example, is like you have to clarify that damn thing, like that has such an intense labor. Like I don't know, I always have this image of my grandma when she's making any broth. She's from Hue, and you're just sitting there and you're just skimming, and then you put it in the fridge and you skim more fat and you just keep skimming to get that clarity, because quality broth in Vietnam more often than not is attributed to how clear your broth is visually and how clean the flavors are. And that's such a labor of love. When people talk about, oh, my pho broth takes 12 hours, it's not just like you sit there for 12 hours. You literally have to be skimming, right? I don't know, like my grandma, I just remember when I was, in elementary school, and she would take care of us when my parents are working, but you just grandma's just sitting there like skimming this damn thing. This is not something that you just sit and it takes care of itself, and that's something that's so underrated and underpriced. Like we undervalue our labor as a community so much, and especially when we're saying, why is there a $25-$30 bowl of pho? It's like, well, why is there a $30 bowl of ramen? It's in essence, in principle and philosophy, the same thing. Noodles, fat, and meat. It's insane.
It's the cultural branding, and it's the root of where these thoughts and concepts take shape in the ground. I had Min Pham from Finnicite on, and these, and obviously she's number one in 2021, number one restaurant, LA Times, and talk about these things, and we need more people like Min and you to beat the drums, these drums that of culture, to instill in the public like this idea that we are now having to really focus on rebranding.
We have to focus on rebranding, and we have to accept no substitutes. I think that's one of the things that's really important. Like the Vietnamese lexicon has become so accustomed to Dai Kai. Everything is Dai Kai. Oh, I don't have all the ingredients for pho, but Dai Kai. And I was like, oh, but then if you build on a carbon copy of a carbon copy of a carbon copy, every Dai Kai starts to snowball, and then you become left with with fake fish sauce taking over real fish sauce. We have to accept no substitutes as a people because, for example, rice paper that's mixed with tapioca flour or something like that. Like, we have to be very stringent and just transparent with each other. Like, hey, I'm okay with eating something that's diluted down for cost. I get it, but just be real with me. Like, I don't mind. Like, we do that all the time in the US, like fake meat, mystery meat. Like, it's kind of like a running joke, right? But there's a level of transparency. It's like, hey, yeah, you go to McDonald's, you're probably not going to be eating real meat when you're eating chicken nuggets, but we all know that. But why can't we have that kind of just, hey, yeah, this is not real fish sauce, but let's not call it fish sauce. Anyways, I think, like, we have to demand no substitutes, because when we think about, if we even step aside from like ramen, we look at donburi or any kind of rice bowl in Japanese cuisine, the reverence put behind rice is insane. Could you imagine us doing the same thing for tikka? Like, that's just, unheard of. It's not even, I don't know. It should be if it's not already on someone's project. But I think, like, yeah, I think we demand no substitutes.
And going back to Min from Finnekite, she has porridge and puffs, and it really, she talks about this whole idea of the rice and how they get the rice to bloom or to blossom a certain way to get the full flavors for the Dzao that they do. And they're known all over LA for that, right? That level and attention to detail is what we need culturally if we want to elevate to brands like, LV or Hermes, or,
Yeah.
you name these luxury things that we like to buy in the Vietnamese culture. We like to purchase luxury goods at the upper high end levels, but we need to start to change our mindset and to walk lockstep with the old brands of Europe and other parts of Asia.
Yeah. And yeah, we definitely deserve it too. Like, I think we can't undersell ourselves. I think it's tough. I think there's a lot of like I think it's a scary thing to do. I think a lot of, like, it really comes out when it comes, like, when rubber meets the road. Like, I definitely think when we were first doing Song Cai, for example, it was just so nerve-wracking to even do that. I don't think we have that collective confidence. Yeah, I don't know. I think we're living in a day and age where I feel very fortunate because it's changing. And I think there's so many Vietnamese creatives now that are really pushing the envelope. And I think it's an amazing thing to see collectively that yes, we have all these problems. We have this Dai Kai, we have all this, we can go on and on about the issues, but I think one of the amazing things, and to not underplay it, is we have so many Vietnamese creatives that are trying to push the boundary and are changing the not only the quality of products, but then the just like the global and community brand image.
Now you have a few lines that you're developing and working on to release in the US. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, we are developing. So speaking of like Singwai and things like that, is like the strategy behind doing a gin, which is not a traditionally Vietnamese product, is because of that. It's a practical vehicle that has a Western quality to introduce Vietnamese ingredients. But now, because we have that kind of foothold, we can actually diverge into products that are more traditionally rooted entirely in Vietnamese culture. So, for example, we've got two products. It's a natural rice wine, which is in a family of products in Vietnam called Dzao Cai. So the etymology of that is Cai, very much similar to Song Cai, his mother. And it's just fermented rice wine. It's no different from sake, for example. And this is also another interesting thing, is because rice wine is a mistranslation. Most people think of rice wine as like this cloudy white distilled product or clear distilled product that they get, that's like moonshine, but it's not true. That's actually liquor or spirit. But what we're doing is we're trying to produce a traditional product called Dzao Cai. And then the second one is a traditional Dzao Thuốc, but made in the fashion of the Red Dzao community, who are just immensely renowned for their botany skills. It's actually quite amazing. Both of these products have international counterparts. And I think one of the interesting challenges for us is to make sure our pricing strategy is neck and neck with those counterparts. And it's just, I think, like, to me, I think this is going to be adding to the fulfillment of what we're doing with Song Cai. So for example, Song Cai, for example, is making sure we're not any cheaper than sake or natural wine out there, or like Dzao Tuoc, we're not any cheaper than any of the Italian Amaros, which are enjoying a renaissance in the US right now, for example. But then it's also changing the mindset of Vietnamese people when you think about, rice wine, when you think about Dzao, that it's not just Dzao Tuoc Bach, and you have this negative connotation of, oh yeah, is that like snake wine or whatever? Like, no, yeah, snake wine, sure, there is like a level of traditionalness to it, but then it's like it's become this thing that's like a gag factor. I think that's something that we're really excited to be a part of, is actually now producing traditional products, but then also making sure that we're being mindful of how we message it, brand it, and then price it, so that we're not devaluing the labor that goes behind it.
Jesus, I think about the two-prong problems, or not problems, but things that you have to resolve. The first thing you have to do is you got to make a damn good product, right?
Yeah.
The first thing you have to figure out, you got to figure out how to do this and get the palette, because there are comps out there. There's comps that you got to compete with out in the big, real, wide, messy world. And then the other side of that is, how do you get the pricing believable to the standards of the counterparts of the comps that you're trying to sell against? And
yeah,
it's such a huge undertaking, but this is what is central to the game of rebranding or branding, building branding in Vietnam in its entirety. If you think about it, we're talking about two things: production, and we're talking about the branding side of it. And if Europe is doing it with their perfumes, and if they're doing it with their alcohol, Vietnam needs, and we can, because we have 98 million people or something like that. We have to be. It's just a flip of a switch that we just turn these beautiful countryside villages and folks into legendary distillery houses, or places that we crank out just amazing product. And it's just an issue of believing and not believing.
Yeah, and it's so tough too, because it's just, when I went to France, I talking about France as opposed to going, I'm not trying to like romanticize France. France has got a lot of problems, but the way they've done their AOPs and structured the villages. So, because we went to Jura and we went to Arbois to visit the wineries and the cheese makers, and the kind of reverence that people have in the pride. And it's, yes, you're absolutely right. They don't need money, because I remember calling around to even just visit, and like, no, we're not gonna, you know what I mean? Like, we don't need you to come visit. Like, like, wow. It was just like, it wasn't rude. It was just like this very French attitude. It was like, is it worth me getting out of bed? No, I'm just gonna, you know what I mean? It's very laissez, I don't know, but it's a really big problem. I think it's a really huge undertaking. So I'll take the example of the Amaro. Again, this is a problem, because I have to use an Italian word to even describe it, right? Because Dzao Tuoc, let's just say it's the Dzao Tuoc, for example. When we sent it to a competition recently, we actually got awarded silver, which is really high in terms of a ranking. We were pitted against mostly Italian brands, Italian and US brands. But there was no category for Dzao Tuoc. We have to compete under Amaro, under something else, so automatically we already have to don another set of layers that we are not, there's no category for us. And even if there was, like, who knows of Dzao Tuoc? Like, we by default have to start playing, we're never on home court advantage in that sense. And I think it's also chicken or the egg, because the problem that we run into with Song Cai is we have to build our own supply chains, and we have to defend our own supply chains, because modernization depletes, we what I'm trying to say is, the thing is, it's a chicken or the egg thing right now.
Yeah.
And these raw ingredients will not exist in the future unless we actively fight to preserve and develop them. I think we take it for granted that these things will just continue to be passed down. They don't. And that's the real shocking thing is, just recently, like when we were using like these native varietals of rice, even though they're famous, Nip Gai Hua Vang, the amount of land dedicated to actually cultivating is decreasing significantly. I think right now, native rice, I think I was just doing research on this. It's like less than 5% of our total rice production. You know,
Wow.
yeah, that's how fast hybridization has actually taken a hold of in Vietnam. Because the things that we're proud of in Vietnam, right? Oh, we're the second largest exporter of coffee, the second largest exporter of rice in the world. What that usually comes at a cost to is we destroy our native seed database, our native strain database, for example. We're no longer using things that we could be calling AOP. If you look at Japanese cultivation, or even like the French cultivation or Spanish, they're so obsessed with that hyper locality. Sake is tied to a lot of local, hyper local rice varieties, for example.
I mean, you think about French wines, everything is
Yeah.
built on Bordeaux or Champagne
Yes,
or cognac. It's everything is built on the region, the pride of the region of where it comes from. And we don't have that.
exactly. We don't. We have the necessary things to do it, but we just don't enforce it.
We don't have
Say,
the
for example,
mindset.
yeah, Nip Gai Hua Vang has a designation. And when you call to go find the farmers, they're selling the land for industrial development or real estate development, which is so sad, because I always say, like in Vietnam, when we have the opportunity to speak to decision makers, we say, like, once you lose it, you can never get it back. Khi mà đã mất rồi thì không bao giờ lấy lại được.
Yeah.
Because you can't, it's just, that represents thousands of years of preservation, of passing on from one generation to another, and it can just be gone like that. There's no way, like, once you lose it, who's going to do it? Like, it's gone. That's the really scary thing about agriculture, is once it's gone, it's gone. And I think, like, when we're doing these projects like the Maro, the Zio Talk, for example, the thing that we're going to say, and we haven't published this yet, is the original recipe that the medicine woman who we're working with, Go Lima Chat, we no longer have all the ingredients to make that recipes. So we have to actually repropagate all those seeds and those varieties. So as our hope is 10 years down the line, we can slowly start to say, hey, the recipe that was made in 2023, yes, that was great. But now in 2033, we actually have restored the recipe to its former self, like actually all the ingredients. And the pure fact of the matter is, the reason why we can't do that now is those seeds and those plant varietals no longer are cultivated, and they're being destroyed, because we're also chopping down forests for commercial forestry, or for real estate development, or for road development and things like that. So it's like we're so set on development that sometimes we don't stop to think about the unintended consequences of our fast growing economy in Vietnam. We're so proud that we're one of the fastest growing economies in the world, but hey, why don't we stop and say, was it really necessary to bulldoze that forest, and we'll never get it back? I think that's one of the scary things that we have to deal with. Yeah, I think that's an existential question that we have, is, do we want to be a completely modern society, or how do we also keep our traditions alive? Because they're going to be gone, and they're going to be just museum pieces.
And what about activists in Vietnam? I mean, there were, movements in the federal government in the US to protect and preserve parks and national forests and big swaths of land, to preserve it for children and grandchildren, for the ages, that would be able to enjoy the beauty of the landscape of the United States. Now, alongside of that kind of mindset is protecting the seeds, protecting the processes and the cultural values that are coming from the people that live there. But there's no culture of that kind of preservation happening in Vietnam, or is there? Maybe I don't know much about the activists that are doing it.
Yeah, I mean, there is a concerted effort. The really tough thing about Vietnam is always enforcing and execution. Because say, for example, native seed preservation is actually written into law, into decisions, into ordinances, into circulars. Um, there's legal precedents and policy precedents to actually promote native seed preservation. But the problem is on the execution level. I think when people have to make the decision between development and native seed preservation and the money that's there to back it, native seed preservation almost always falls by the wayside. I think in 2008, one of the institutes that we work with for native seed preservation, they were funded by the government to do that. Actually, they went around and collected all these seeds and tried to preserve them. In 2008, the budget just went dry and everything just, in a hot and humid environment, you have to continually upkeep your seed bank, and most of the seeds are no longer viable, and that's just, no one's funding it anymore. Most of the, when you talk about like what is the role of government, I think very clearly, and also in the US as well, like what is the role of government? I think the role of government is really at its core to provide, like in the Vietnamese language, it's called like an áo khoác, which is like a jacket, essentially. This is like the áo khoác, and from that, people can operate, and I think, is it the government's responsibility to actually do these native seed propagation programs? Potentially, yes. From an American standpoint, we say, oh, yes, because it's for the social good, it's for the collective good, and that's the role of government. But then the problem is, if you look at the tax base of the American country, of the country of the United States of America, the actual tax base that comes from the American citizens that makes up the GDP, or that makes up the percentage of the tax revenue of the U.S. government, I think the percentage was almost quadruple that of Vietnam. I'm not talking about money, like the raw number of like $100 versus
Yeah.
$1. I'm talking about percentage. Like, we as a country in Vietnam are so overly reliant on FDI, like foreign direct investment, like foreign companies to pay taxes, that we don't, like, it puts us on the back foot. This is going off on a little bit of a tangent, but what I'm trying to say is, like, I think like the role of government is to give you the áo khoác first, like the jacket, and it's up to us as people, as citizens, to have that responsibility to do it, because we don't have in Vietnam that same kind of tax base to expect the government to continually fund, say, for example, seed preservation. 2008, the budget was gone, done. Good luck. Sorry. The government ran out of money. And I think that's like that's the challenge that we have. It's not only, yes, the government, we're a little bit more limited based on our tax structure, but then it's also like we as a community also have that kind of responsibility. And it's going along what we've been talking about this entire time is, we have to, we can't accept any substitutes, and we have to play an active stewardship in, preserving the environment, because, let's face it, I pay taxes in Vietnam, but we still have to pay extra to pay the people to go pick up trash. That's something that we take for granted in the US, that, oh, our taxes cover everything. But actually, no, the taxes in Vietnam don't cover everything. Like, we as a community have to come together and actually sweep the roads, make sure that it's clean and things like that. And I think that kind of collective responsibility, it's a metaphor, like, we need to get together as a community to also make sure that we're taking care of ourselves. And we can't expect like the government or, some overarching entity to do it for us. I think that's, and when we do that, then we also have to take responsibility when we mess up, or we also at the same time get to take responsibility when we succeed. For example, I think one of the things that I would err away from is, maybe it's controversial, but we can't always blame the Vietnamese government for the failures collectively. I think the government has its role, but we also have to step up. I'm not saying the Vietnamese government is perfect, but If you look at the law, there is law that says we need to be preserving native seeds. Are we doing it as a collective? I would say no. The statistics point to we're just, you know, if we just look at native seeds and native rice, it's just plummeting. In the last 20 years, I think we've lost over 100,000 hectares, and we're down to like 5% of the GD of rice production and value being from native seeds. And who's that on? In part, it's us. When you look at our distillery, for example, it's a little bit hypocritical, but it's like, yeah, native seeds are more expensive to eat. They may be better, but people like better versus cost. Our distillery, our staff are like, I'd rather eat the cheap rice. It's just like the difference is negligible. I was like, no. Would you imagine a Japanese person saying that? They wouldn't say that. They just like,
Never.
yeah, like we have to demand better for ourselves,
Now, this idea of seed, you've said seed so much. And I recently got wind of a project called Seed, translated to hat here
Yeah.
in Italy. And you are spearheading this with another LA chef, Nguyen from Beu, who's also been on the podcast as well in the early days. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Beo and us are partnering on a project called HAT, which means seed in Vietnamese. It's a food and beverage concept. So where we're aiming to open an actual brick and mortar restaurant bar, but then also a small retail component where we can curate exactly what we're talking about, like very hyper artisanal products from producers who wouldn't have that kind of amplification otherwise. But we chose the name hat because hat not only represents like the smallest common denominator in an agricultural society such as Vietnam, but then what seed and hat really represents is metaphorically and literally the manifestation of passing down of knowledge and labor, blood, sweat, and tears from one generation to another. When you go to villages and you see how people are literally seed houses is what they call them. They have seeds in there that are tens of, decades old that have been left from generation to another generation. It's the next generation's responsibility to keep it growing, And I think that's metaphorical for us is like we have to keep the fire going from our ancestors, In the face of modernity, for example, we can't assume that fish sauce, for example, or native rice will just keep being there for the next generation. We need to have flag holders. We need to have torch bearers, literally and figuratively speaking, to continue that. And that's why I think like the project we chose to name Hat is to physically and metaphorically represent that. So yeah, we're only doing pop-ups right now, but we're aiming for a brick and mortar opening in early 2024. And then also curating other hyper local ingredient products alongside that as well.
Wonderful. And, we get to hear it here first. And, I think you've had one pop-up, you're planning a few more pop-ups this year and to sort of get the ideation out. And I look forward to having you come back on in a few months to talk about where we are with Hat and, hopefully other cultural ideas that we talked about today shifts and we perhaps can get some of the artisans that you've talked about. And overall, I want to get more involvement with Song Cai, more artisans that you nurture and that you take care of in your corner of the world. And, we want to get more of these people, put some spotlights on the work that they do, because it's so important that the cradle of our culture and the cradle of who we are and what it means to be Vietnamese comes from this idea of really enforcing a process of doing what we think is right for the product itself and not Nai Kai.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think yeah, I'm super like humbled and but also honored to be a part of that movement. Like I think we're going to get there as a community and as a people. I think so.
Yeah. Daniel, thank you so much. We will be talking very soon again.
Yeah. Thank you, Kenneth.
Thank you for listening to The Vietnamese with Kenneth Nguyen. The Vietnamese is produced by Brittany Tran. Special thanks to Jane Nguyen, Catherine Nguyen, Tina Pham, Sydney Jamie, and Christo Trin. Please find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Vietnamese Podcast. You can also find us on YouTube, where you can subscribe, like, and comment. Please rate and give us a review wherever you find our podcast.